Hey everyone, Joshua Kirk here with you once again, and now it's time for episode 107 of Album of the Day, in which today I'm gonna, sort of talk about a pop rock band from England who, I've definitely been known to be, one of the most popular and biggest bands in the 90s, especially in that genre known as Britpop. In the 90s, British bands, were sort of, releasing this uh, were sort of, playing this music called a Britpop. This was around the time of artists like Blur, Pulp, and the one I'm going to talk about today, the one and only Oasis. For a fair amount of time in the 90s, they were the biggest band in the world. I'm sure all of you music fans know that. Which I'm here to review their second studio album, released in 1995, and by far like their magnum opus in their discography. The album is called What's the Story, Morning Glory. It's the follow-up to 1994's successful debut album, Definitely Maybe. Excuse me. I wanted to review this today because, in my personal opinion, this is the best Britpop album ever made, in my opinion. It is, at least in my book. My parents have had this CD for a while, actually. I just didn't really get around to listening to it all the way through until, 2015 or something like that. But I do think it is a really good album, and I, am almost, baffled to see that, I was late coming to this record, because it is certainly a classic album, and definitely one of my favorite, English rock albums. Of course, it has the sticker there featuring Morning Glory, Wonderwall, and Don't Look Back in Anger. Then there's the back. And of course, my parents have owned Definitely Maybe for a while, which I did finally get around to listening to that too, which I do think it is a great album. There's some really good songs on it. But to be honest, I feel that, What's the Story, Morning Glory is objectively a more consistently produced and written album from the band. Because Definitely Maybe was a little more raw and wasn't so much about lyrics. It was really more about some really good guitar riffs from Noel Gallagher and some really top-notch vocal performances from lead singer Liam Gallagher. Unfortunately, the Gallagher brothers fighting is what caused the band to split up in 2009, but we will always remember Oasis as one of the greatest Britpop bands of all time. Here's a disc. And here's some of the lyrics. And I know this album, along with Definitely Maybe, were actually recently re-released on vinyl and CD in 2014. But I'm not gonna get those because I'm okay with just the original copies that I have. Plus, I know that there are some people that some Oasis fans sort of had a lot of negative hype about the re-releasing, which I know that how that can happen. Unless you want to get it on vinyl or stuff like that, or you're someone who likes to get all the rarities and stuff. But anyway, that's the CD copy of What's the Story, Morning Glory. Now, sure, the band did break up in 2009, but I think they broke up for a wise reason. Bands get back together for the money and stuff like that, and we'll still be playing music and playing shows separately, but we're just not gonna, but just Oasis reunion is not gonna happen. I think it's a pretty wise thing that Liam and Noel sort of, decided, so there was more than just them fighting that caused the band to break up, but Anyway, let's just, get on to the review, shall we? The album opens up strong with the song Hello, which actually starts out with a little sample of Wonderwall. You wouldn't really hear it unless you listen to it with headphones, but there's actually a little bit of Wonderwall sampled at the beginning, which I think is pretty cool. But then eventually it goes into the actual song, which has just some really killer, badass, guitar playing on it. It's definitely sort of a hard rocker, which I think opens the album on a very high note for sure. And its lyrics deal with like a terrible relationship, where apparently the narrator is very frustrated, at his girlfriend, friend, and has a feeling that she still owes him, or something like that. So it's definitely one example of Oasis going for maybe a more bitter side without being too pretentious or anything like that. So that's what I really like about this track. Also the fact that, Noel Gallagher's guitar playing, guitar solo at the end is awesome. Awesome. Which, the interesting thing about Oasis is that although Liam sings all the words, Noel Gallagher is actually the main lyricist, although he only sings lead on one track on this whole record. I think it's interesting how he does that, because apparently I heard Liam, tried to write a song a few times and felt that he was just terrible at it, so that's why he let his brother handle all the songwriting, as well as writing most of the guitar parts and stuff like that. Although Liam is the lead singer, technically Noel's pretty much in charge of the whole band in terms of, getting Liam to sing his wonderful lyrics and all that. And then next is pretty much the first hit off of this record, Roll With It. And I know, many people have divided opinions on this track. Some people say it's too poppy, others hail it as a classic. Me personally, while it is one of the poppiest songs in Oasis's career without being super top 40 or anything like that, I still think it's a good song. It's very catchy. I mean, the hook definitely gets stuck in your head for a while. And actually, one part of this track that doesn't get talked about very often is, I love that part where the cowbell kicks in. And of course, has some pretty, solid riffs on there. So yeah, it's definitely, it's not the best song, but it's actually not that bad, and actually a pretty solid pop tune. Although it's really more about the hook, since the lyrics aren't really too interesting. But it's really more about the hook, and really more about how catchy it is. The next song is, of course, the song everyone knows, the song everyone has heard at least once in their life, Wonderwall. Back in the 90s, you could not escape this track. It was played on the radio constantly, and of course the video was used constantly on MTV, and stuff like that. And this is the one everyone has covered, including one of my favorites, Ryan Adams. He covered this song on his album Love Is Hell, which I think he did a really phenomenal job with it. Really gorgeous cover right there. Now back to the original Wonderwall. Is this a good song? Yeah. But does it get a little old? Yeah. It's not necessarily something I'm gonna skip over, but it's just, I hear it and I'm like, man, I've heard this tons of times, pretty much. And of course we all know the whole deal with this track. It's driven by acoustic guitar, has these really nice swelling strings in the background, which are actually provided a mellotron. It's not like a real string section. is actually a weird, like, English keyboard instrument called a mellotron that's given us the strings on here. And then, of course, it's lyrics about an imaginary friend saving your life. So it may be a little sappy to some, but yeah, it's still a good song. It's still one that will always be remembered as one of Oasis's, like, most beloved songs to date, pretty much. Although it is kind of overplayed on the radio. And the next track on here is called Don't Look Back in Anger, this is the one where Noel sings the lead vocal, and we say his vocal just sounds so fantastic on this track. It's, kind of sweet to hear his own voice, because it's, really, distinctive, and I actually heard that, Noel was, like, supposed to sing on either Wonderwall or Don't Look Back in Anger, which meant banger, stuff like that. Of course, Liam chose to sing on a Wonderwall. Of course, chose to sing on a Wonderwall, which I think actually works better for him, to be honest. So I think it was wise that Noel decided to sing on "Don't Look Back in Anger," because he has that sort of, emotional performance that I think really fits well with. With like the lyrics of this track, and of course it has just an epic hook, which is obviously makes this track a staple, like an arena rock staple for Oasis, because everybody could just sing along with it. And the lyric that mentions Sally, I think I heard references like Noel's sister. Is actually, sort of referenced in one lyric on this track. I think I heard. And of course, it's a great track with some great riffs and a really, just a really nice sort of vibrant sort of wall of strings going on in the background. Again, provided via some mellotrons. And then there's the song "Hey Now," which I think this is a pretty interesting track because the verses are all sort of most songs would have a really explosive chorus, but actually this track has some explosive verses, but the chorus is kind of a little more toned down and a little darker and softer. So I think it's a very interesting sort of song structure that they went for here on this track. And following that is Swamp Song number 1, which it's basically sort of a little instrumental jam that Oasis is doing with some harmonica to go in there, which it's not credited in the liner notes, but I read that the harmonica that you're hearing on the Swamp Songs is played by a guy named Paul Weller, who is credited playing guitar and singing on one of these tracks, which I'll get into later. And then there's the track "Some Might Say," which this is the last song that Oasis ever recorded with Tony McCarroll playing drums on it. Since he was their original drummer, he played drums throughout, definitely maybe, but then eventually sort of left the band. But he was still in the band when they recorded this song until drummer Andy White eventually joined the group. I do really like this song too. Let me look at some of the lyrics in it. It's sort of this song sort of talks about how some might say that sunshine follows thunder, and also that that we should never ponder, and there's also some there's also some pretty clever wordplay on this track, like the sink is full of fishes. She's got dirty dishes on the brain, and of course, and of course, it's definitely a very very catchy uh, track as well. So I could see why this one became a single, and it actually sounds like it could have come off of Definitely Maybe a little bit, since it has that kind of raw, sort of grainy sort of sound that Definitely Maybe had. Maybe had for sure. While this album is a little more polished and streamlined than Definitely Maybe is. Since they're in like full studio here, and I heard that Noel actually plays bass throughout Definitely Maybe, although Paul McGuigan is credited playing bass on that album. Next song on here is one that no one really talks about for whatever reason. It's called Cast No Shadow. A really gorgeous acoustic ballad with, these, really nice sort of, with these really nice, fluid, like, very colorful, mellotron strings that really, chill the vibe of the track, and it's definitely got a more eerie sort of vibe to it that I love from most other songs on this record. To pair with its, pretty dark, sort of lyrics, and also some really nice sort of like, almost like Beatles-inspired background vocals from Noel, to pair with Liam's voice on here. So I'm hearing some obvious Beatles influence throughout this record, which was a very big influence, especially on Noel. And this is one track where I definitely hear some of those sort of influences coming through on what is by far one of the best deep cuts on the whole record. And next is another one that no one really talks about that I think is a great song called She's Electric. Which also has some pretty, clever sort of, lyrics on it as well. And of course, this one is, and this one actually has a little more of kind of a, I'm actually hearing maybe a little sort of, like I'm actually hearing like a little bit of like alt country influence going on this track, in terms of like, the guitar tone on this track as well. And it's of course, and then of course, it's, also got this kind of, heavily like noted sort of, piano in the background as well, obviously playing along with the guitars on here. The guitars on here. And then there's the song Morning Glory, which is another single on here. There's like over 6 singles on this record. Jeez. Anyway, the track Morning Glory, one of my favorite tracks on here. I love that guitar riff that kind of sounds like a siren going off. Like, wait, 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 wait. Wait, 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 wait. Like, it's definitely, pretty nice, guitar tone in there, like, which I think sort of makes sense with sort of the edgy sort of, sort of vibe of this track, which is portrayed very obviously in its kind of experimental, noisy sort of, music background, and its lyrics that actually deal with like drugs and stuff like that. So definitely one of the edgiest Oasis songs out there, while still being very playable for like alternative pop rock radio for sure. Sure, and yeah, like definitely just a killer track with some great vocals on it. Like Liam's vocal performances on this record, I think are very fantastic, and he really sort of takes sort of the and he really sort of takes the powerful lyrics to a whole new level with his sort of emotional sort of with his emotional vocal, which has a very authentic English accent to it, which you can tell this is like a Britpop band for sure. And then there's Swamp Song number 2, which sort of continues the whole sort of swamp instrumental thing. It basically ties the record together, although it's like a little piece of filler in there. And I will admit I preferred Swamp Song number 1 over Swamp Song 2 for sure. And then it closes with one of my favorite Oasis songs of all time, Champagne Supernova. This track, pretty much pretty much everything about this track is just very, very well done. It's more psychedelic. It takes a more psychedelic direction with the guitars, and there's like a delayed melodica in the background. And also with the guitar tones, and also with the little echoey like reverb effects on on Liam Gallagher's vocal as well. And also maybe its lyrics, go for sort of a psychedelic sort of, drug induced pretty much, and like I don't know if drug induced is the right word, but it sort of fits in with sort of the title of this track, and maybe some of the lyrics like "Where were you while we were getting high," and plus, but by far like my favorite part of this track is like that part towards the middle where the whole thing just explodes and and gets into some really epic guitar improvising. There's some nice little harmonized guitars on them, like towards the end of this track that just blow my mind for sure. My mind for sure. It sort of explodes. I know there was recently like a masterpiece review for this album from Consequence of Sound, which I actually found those videos to be pretty interesting. And in the masterpiece review, the reviewer sort of described the explosion that sort of happens on Champagne Supernova as like pulling a plug on an airtight seal, pretty much. I know it's kind of dramatic, but you can see what I'm saying here with this track. Definitely, flows so well all throughout its long runtime, which lasts about 7 minutes. So I think it's kind of crafty that a song this long would actually get some airplay on radio and actually become a staple at their concerts and stuff like that. And like this is a song where Paul Weller appears playing additional guitar and backing vocals, so I can see where the harmonized guitar playing comes from. But yeah, just overall, I feel that this record definitely exemplifies all what made 90s Britpop like such a favorite popular music genre in the 90s. I mean, in the early 90s, Seattle grunge was becoming the big thing, like with Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, you name it, when it comes to grunge. I like how all these British bands came up and say, hey, enough of the grunge now. Let's give popular music a little more variety for a while. So that's what started, so that's when eventually Britpop initially was sort of an unknown sort of, underground sort of genre, but, eventually bands like Oasis and Blur eventually turned it into, like a very popular, genre of music that would eventually, I think it's pretty cool how that happened. The same thing with like how Weezer, gave nerd rock some mainstream popularity, or how Radiohead gave some, more experimental music some popularity, so I think it's really interesting how that all happened in the 90s. But, yeah, what's the story Morning Glory? I'm gonna have to give this maybe a 9 out of 10. The reason I don't give it a full 10 is because, Wonderwall does get kind of old, and also, the Swamp songs are really mostly just to tie the record together, but I pretty much love, like, pretty much every other track on this album. So, yeah, that's my review of What's the Story, Morning Glory, the second album by Oasis. See you for episode 108.